Quraysh disliked what he preached about equality for all. The more he preached, the more incensed the Quraysh became. So they tried to make him change his mind by offering him money, power, anything that he wanted.
To all their proposals, Muhammad gave the same answer. I haven't come here to accumulate wealth or to be your leader or to be your king. I've only come here for one purpose, and that is to be the messenger of God and to convey his word. And if you accept, it will be beneficial for you. But if you don't, I'll simply wait and await God's judgment. Now, clearly, for the Meccan authorities, gentle persuasion was not going to work. They were going to have to try something else, something a little bit more aggressive.
Gentle persuasion was now replaced by violent persecution. Muhammad's followers, especially those with no clan or tribal protection, such as slaves, women and orphans, were now subjected to brute force. According to Muslim tradition, some were thrown on burning coals, others cruelly beaten and tortured, and some women were even stabbed to death.
Now this is because Muhammad is challenging the Quraysh where it hurts, in their purse, because the old cult is very much bound up with the whole business of Mecca. People come to the Kaaba and they come to worship in the Kaaba, and this will be really bad for trade. They are very, very angry. They feel it is a profound threat.
Muhammad and his small band of followers faced a very difficult situation. They were attacked in public, both verbally and physically, and in private, they had nowhere they could meet and pray, 1,000,000 miles away from the freedom of worship that Muslims enjoy today.
This 5-story mosque and Islamic centre is being built here in northwest London. And similar things are being done almost everywhere where Muslims live in the West. And although we take this kind of opportunity for granted today, the Prophet faced a completely different experience when he first tried to gather his own Muslim community amongst his own people in Mecca. What's amazing standing here with you now is that the building of this community centre is so different from the experiences that the Prophet had establishing his own first community, where he didn't have any of the opportunity or freedom.
Well, yes. I mean, those were a very difficult time. Obviously, Islam started. Prophet Muhammad had to work very hard and not allowed to pray, not allowed to do anything what they had to do. And even if they're going for praying, they have to endure a lot of problems, humiliations there, etc. But nowadays, things are different, mashallah.
Instead of trying to resist the Quraysh's persecution with force, the Prophet looked for another way to safeguard his followers. In many ways, a far more radical step. He got them to leave Mecca, to abandon their homes and seek refuge on the other side of the Red Sea, in the African kingdom of Aksum, ruled by King Negus, a Christian. In 615 AD, a group of Muslims secretly left Mecca with their families and settled in a refugee camp in what is now modern-day Ethiopia. The Quraysh were incensed by this exodus. They immediately sent a delegation to Negus, the king of Abyssinia, in order to persuade him to send the exiles back home. Negus the king summoned the leader of the Muslims in order to explain, and after telling the king that Muhammad was in fact the prophet of the one true God, he famously began to recite a verse from the Quran. The verses he read described the virgin birth of Jesus and described him to be a prophet of God. The words worked their miracle, and Negus the king of Abyssinia was moved to tears and allowed the Muslims to stay.
Back in Mecca, the Quraysh began to turn the heat up on Muhammad and his remaining followers. They instituted a citywide ban which basically prevented anyone from having anything to do with Muhammad and his entire clan. They weren't allowed to intermarry, they weren't allowed to trade, they weren't even allowed to buy food from the local markets. In Mecca, Muhammad and his followers were now public enemy number one.
There was now immense pressure on Muhammad and his remaining followers to compromise their message of believing in one God only, and to give in to the Quraysh, or to at least accept some of the other gods worshipped by them. It was at this moment that an event is supposed to have taken place that would lead to a fundamental clash of values, an event that still defines Islam's relationship with the rest of the world. Most Muslims deny that this event ever actually happened, but it has been used by Islam's enemies to condemn both Muhammad and the Quran as bogus.
There are many different accounts of this story, but the main version goes something like this. One day Muhammad was sitting somewhere in the Kaaba when he received a new revelation, one which suggested that he could strike a compromise deal with the Quraysh that would allow them to continue to worship their old gods. Well, when the Quraysh heard this, they were overjoyed. At last, they thought, Muhammad was coming back to their way of thinking.
But now comes the key part of the story, which is that Muhammad is then supposed to have received another revelation that told him his apparent acceptance of the old gods had actually been inspired by Satan. Hence why these verses were later called the Satanic verses. If true, it seems to suggest that Muhammad was able to alter the divine word of God at will, and that in consequence, both Muhammad and the Quran were fake.
Now, of course, Muslims say this incident did not happen and was manufactured by haters of Islam. It then becomes very hard for them to explain, however, how it got into Islamic sources that are relatively early or are, like Zamakhshari, based on earlier Islamic sources that are lost. One wonders how it is that somebody like that, who was a pious Muslim, would have or could have picked up such a thing if it had originated from the enemies of Islam.
There are three different and conflicting versions of this story in the Muslim histories of Muhammad's life compiled after his death. There is no direct reference to it in the Quran, and neither is it mentioned in the earliest and most reliable account of his life by Ibn Ishaq. Neither is there any mention of it in the great hadiths of the 9th century. Muslims do not generally reject traditions because they're critical of Muhammad, but because they cannot be properly verified.
In 1989, a storm of violent protest erupted across the Islamic world when a novel written by Salman Rushdie was published in the UK. The book, The Satanic Verses, is a fictional account of this incident, and Muslims claim depicts Muhammad as an impostor with purely political ambitions, and the Quran as the work of the devil. All over the world, Muslim public opinion was outraged.
Well, the event of 14th of January 1989 is the day when I can very clearly remember there were over 1,000 people to a minimum. And just to show that we do disapprove this material, we will publicly burn this book. And that's what we did at that day.
The burning of the book was just the start. Violent demonstrations and riots broke out all over the Muslim world. Attempts by the Muslim community to have the book banned were opposed by many in the name of freedom of speech. This issue was then taken over by Ayatollah Khomeini, the then leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who declared a fatwa, or religious order, against Rushdie, calling for his death by any means. The fatwa has never been lifted, and although Rushdie survived unharmed, numerous people connected with the book have been attacked and even killed. A single contentious event in Muhammad's life, and one most Muslim scholars believe never took place, was being used to define Muhammad, who he was and what he stood for, and most importantly, what it meant to be a Muslim in today's world.
What this whole issue did was that it highlighted a fundamental difference of views between those in the West who believed that they had a right to say what they wanted to say, and those Muslims who believed that they had a right not to be insulted.
It was a defining moment. It was the first time that the British Muslims came out as a community to assert themselves. But it was also a defining moment internationally. On one hand, they rejected what Rushdie wrote. They were united in condemning the book. But on the other hand, they were also united in condemning the fatwa. They realized what is going on in the West is not acceptable to them. But they also realized at the same time that certain mechanisms in traditional Islam were also not acceptable to them.
This incident led the Muslim community in Britain to feel that they were part of a larger international Islamic community, with Muhammad at its heart. It would also mark the start of a clash between the liberal values so central to Western identity and the more traditional and conservative views in the British Muslim community. And at the heart of this clash was the character of Muhammad himself, and conflicting opinions as to whether he was a force for good or evil in the world. Whatever the truth of this event, in Mecca, Muhammad was locked into a desperate battle of ideas between his new message of the one God and the old tribal values of the Quraysh. The Quraysh had by now imposed even tougher sanctions on Muhammad and his followers. From now on, no one was allowed to do any business with them. They were not allowed to intermarry, trade, or even buy food. But in contrast to some Muslims now, even when faced with this extreme provocation, Muhammad and his followers resisted without resorting to any violence.
In the earliest period, you could argue that a violent confrontation wasn't even feasible. You know, we were talking about tens of people, maybe then hundreds of people, but certainly not more than, say, 200 or so. And so if there was a confrontation, it would have been a massacre. And we certainly wouldn't know such a thing as Islam now.
Muhammad's stoic, non-violent resistance began to pay off. The people of Mecca started to react against the extreme measures imposed on people who had once been their clan relatives.
A huge amount of social pressure began to be exerted on the Quraysh leadership, and within 2 years after they imposed the ban, they had to rescind it. But this was by no means the end of Muhammad's troubles. What Muslims call his year of sorrows was about to begin.
A few months after the ban had been lifted, Muhammad's wife and the constant rock of his life, Khadija, died. Muhammad was devastated. She had been his beloved wife, his closest companion and advisor for 25 years. She had been the first to recognize him as the prophet of God, and had been the first person he had turned to when confronted by the terrifying and bewildering experience of revelation.
She must have been astonishing in that she was the first person to accept the revelations. I mean, you can almost say that she was the first Muslim because she believed in the revelations before the Prophet himself. And so she had that instinctive ability to recognize authenticity and genius. We see her in the sources as a very maternal figure. And this is something the Prophet had lost himself. He had lost his own mother. I mean, he really loved Khadija. You know, Western critics often sneer at the Prophet's sort of opportunistic marriage to the wealthy widow. That's not borne out in the sources. He loved her all his life. His later wives used to hate the mention of her because they knew that none of them could compete with her in his heart.
Then, a few months later, Muhammad was hit by another devastating loss: the death of his uncle, Abu Talib, the man who had protected him from the worst attempts of the Quraysh to crush him. The leadership of Muhammad's clan now fell into the hands of his most violent opponents. Attacks against him increased. his enemies now gave him a stark warning. Stop spreading your message, or your life could be in danger. Muhammad and his small band of followers were now at their most vulnerable. Half of them had fled to Ethiopia, the rest were almost in hiding in Mecca. His enemies were now openly making plans to crush his embryonic Islamic movement, and even to kill him. The next step he would take would be critical. It would shape not only his future, but the history of the world. In the next episode, Muhammad's persecution by the Quraysh intensifies and he's forced to leave his hometown of Mecca. It also brings him into conflict with some of the Jewish tribes of Arabia, leading to one of the most controversial events of his life, a massacre whose consequences still reverberate today.
I think it seared itself into the Muslim historical memory, and to that extent it has had an impact that we feel down to this day.
Stay with us here on BBC HD to meet Jazz next in Small Team, Bigger World.